Hey there guys, Portal Master here. Now, I'm sure everyone here is fully aware of the game Skylanders Spyro's Adventure and the giant Skylanders franchise that spawned out of Spyro's Adventure. But what if I told you that that was almost something completely different? Something known as Spyros Kingdom. Welcome everyone to the first episode in my series, A Brief History of Skylanders. The idea that would eventually be known as Skylanders Spyro's Adventure got its start back in 2009 when Activision acquired the Spyro license through their merger with Vivendi. As soon as they got the license, they got to work on a brand new Spyro game. I almost said Skylanders, but essentially that is what it would become. They knew immediately that they wanted to take the Spyro franchise in a different direction than it had ever been taken in before. They initially toyed around with these three main ideas. Ironically, none of them included toys. The first of this was a tiny version of Spyro that would run around in the real world, run around on bookshelves as they called it. This was sort of their first idea to be a little different. This one never really went anywhere. They also proposed the idea for a dark, gritty, adult, realistic version of Spyro. We'll come back to this one in a minute. The third idea that they essentially had was kind of basically Super Paper Spyro. Now, the one that I said actually that we would come back to was the dark, adult, gritty Spyro game, which, as you know, never happened, but it almost did because this is what they decided they wanted to do. They created an idea for a Spyro game that would be dark. It was actually going to be violent, and there was even going to be blood incorporated in this game. Idea was for a 16 and up Spyro game. Far from what we got with Skylanders Spyro's Adventure, but just bear with me, this was the original idea. Well, Activision kind of realized that if they did a game that was dark, gritty, bloody, violent Spyro, was it really even Spyro? It was such a far cry from the original idea for Spyro games that they decided that that's not what they wanted to do with it. But they did want to stick with a more adult-oriented Spyro game, even though it wasn't going to be as dark and gritty as it was originally supposed to be. This eventually led to them creating an MMORPG-style Spyro game where it was essentially World of Warcraft, but with Spyro and dragons from the Spyro franchise. In this Spyros Kingdom, which was the initial idea for this game, you can see right here on screen, not in this entire clip because I'm not showing the entire demo reel. This was a demo reel that was created by Helios Interactive that was supposed to sort of be a proof of concept for this game. You can't see it in this, but there was ideas for combat, base building, and doing quests and such. Obviously, this didn't pan out, but as you can see, there is this sort of piece of game, reel that did actually make it into existence. I didn't know that this existed until honestly a few days ago when I started doing research for this video. So I will leave links to all of the sources that I used down in the description below, and that will include the link to the full version of this video. But as you can see, this was the concept that Activision decided that they wanted to go with for some time, Spyro's Kingdom. And while Spyro's Kingdom would keep its name for quite some time, the concept of the game changed pretty drastically as time went on. This was still in the 2009 time period. Activision wanted more, though. As was stated in one of the interviews from 2012, it was a game developers conference that I was listening to. I listened to almost the entire hour-long interview, and one thing they kept saying was Activision and Toys for Bob wanted more. They wanted to go bigger. They wanted something that would redefine what it means to be a Spyro game and would set the bar higher. So, although they kept the original name for Spyro's Kingdom, the idea for it once again shifted pretty drastically. They also decided to change the age range once again, lowering it down and going to appeal to kids. They still were going to keep it as a quest-based RPG, but it wasn't going to look anything like that demo reel from Helios Interactive that I showed you earlier. This version of Spyro's Kingdom was the idea from around the 2010 time period. Essentially, 2009 was sort of the first iteration of Spyro's Kingdom. 2010, early to mid 2010 anyway, was sort of the idea for the second generation Spyro's Kingdom. And then from there on, it eventually turned into Skylanders, sort of in the late 2010 time frame, shortly before the game was formally announced at the New York Toy Fair in February of 2011. This second iteration of Spyro's Kingdom, despite not playing the same way as the Skylanders games that we would come to know, did bear much more visual resemblance to the games that we would eventually get. Here we can see a mock-up of the original website idea for Spyro's Kingdom. On this website, we can actually see several familiar faces here. We see a rock dragon that would eventually become known as Bash. We see a slightly outdated version of Eruptor. We also see Stealth Elf. We see a Spyro that looks very different than the final version. We also see a version of Ghost Roaster, who was at the time known as Ghost Eater. And we also see over there at the very, in the side, we see a little slime dude. And this guy would eventually be redesigned to be known as Zap. At this point, though, these 6 characters were on their own little hub worlds, and despite the fact that these would eventually sort of become like the elemental hub worlds sort of idea for Skylanders, these guys were just the quest givers in their own respective worlds. And they would give out quests, and it was still, at this point, again, this was a quest-based RPG. None of the characters shown on this island at this point in the design process of Spyro's Kingdom, none of them were playable, and that includes Spyro. Spyro was not a playable character. This meant some things had to change. Now, as we can see on this website mock-up, this version of the game was originally designed to be released in July of 2010. And obviously this game did not get released in July of 2010. So why exactly did it get pushed back so much further? Well, we now know, but what was the sort of design change that they realized? Well, first of all, they realized, hey, wouldn't it be cool if these things were toys and could somehow interact with the game? That was sort of their first thought. But their second thought was also, wait a second, is it really a Spyro game if there's more than one quest giver than just Spyro? And Spyro still isn't playable. So, essentially, they kind of scrapped the idea for that iteration of Spyro's Kingdom and sort of came up with like a third iteration of Spyro's Kingdom that didn't last nearly as long. And in this iteration, there were actually multiple playable characters, and one of those was Spyro. The rest were those characters that you see on those little island platforms. The quest givers essentially turned into the playable characters of this third little iteration of Spyro's Kingdom that, to my knowledge, lasted the least amount of time. This is kind of the portion of the video where I kind of have to make a few educated guesses because there was less information provided about this portion of development than any other portion that I was able to find online. Around this time, they redesigned the game. I'm not sure if it was still an MMORPG when they initially decided to turn these these 6 characters. I assume that there were actually 8 because I know that Bomb Troll, who would eventually become Boomer, was another one of the early Spyro's Kingdom characters that eventually received a redesign. But I don't know at this point if the game was still an MMORPG, if it was quest-based. I don't really know at what point they decided to change it to an actual dungeon crawler, which is essentially what Spyro's Adventure and subsequent Skylanders games ended up being. They were dungeon crawlers, not quest-based RPGs. So I don't know when that change was made, but here we can see the final sort of piece of concept that we have for Spyro's Kingdom is an in-store display. It was around this time where they decided to change the characters over to playable figurines, but I don't think at this point that the idea for the original 32 Skylanders had been conceived just yet. As you can see though, this bears striking resemblance to the displays that would eventually make it into stores for Spyro's Adventure. But again, this isn't where our story ends. At some point, the idea for having 32 Skylanders was conceived, and the game was fully switched over from this third final iteration of Spyro's Kingdom into the iteration of Skylanders Spyro's Adventure that we now know and love. At this point, though, this was in, I assume, early 2011 or late 2010, the game was switched over to Spyro's Adventure, and we're going to talk more about that later. But at some point when all this was going on, they were like, hey, we have all this old stuff that we've been working on since literally 2009. Let's try to, as the word goes, retrofit it for the brand new game, which means taking the old assets from the first, second, and third, probably mainly the second and third iterations of Spyro's Kingdom, and let's turn them into what would eventually become in Spyro's Adventure. Now, I'm not going to go into the full details of how they did this. If you want to watch the Game Developers Conference video that I have linked down in the description, because that is where I got the majority of this information from. But anyway, they pulled a lot of the old assets from Spyro's Kingdom, switched them over, redesigned them for Spyro's Adventure, and now we have the game that we know and love, Skylanders Spyro's Adventure. So, despite the fact that none of us ever got to play Spyro's Kingdom, we've essentially all played a version of it. It's called Skylanders Spyro's Adventure. And join me next week for the next episode of A Brief History of Skylanders, where we will be discussing in more detail the early days of Spyro's Adventure, why it was able to still make it out in time, despite the fact that this crazy development stuff was still going on in 2010 and 2011 at the very beginning, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. That's pretty much the story of Spyro's Kingdom. There is a lot of information that I had to pack into a somewhat short period of time. Hopefully I did a good job. I think this may be the most detailed and shortest video on Spyro's Kingdom that exists on YouTube, so I really hope you guys enjoyed it. I actually wrote a script for this video. I didn't stick to it completely, but I actually wrote a script for it, so I hope you guys enjoyed. Like I said, it was also kind of difficult to try to balance out where I was going to stop with Spyro's Kingdom and start for Spyro's Adventure, which, as I said, will be the topic of next week's video. So I hope you guys will stay tuned for that and the rest of the series, A Brief History of Skylanders. That's all I have for you guys today, though. Thank you guys so much for watching. Special thanks to all my patrons on Patreon, especially Portal Power TV, and I hope you guys remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Be sure especially to comment down below, because as a reminder, at the end of this series, I will be doing a comment response video to all the things that you guys have to say that I specifically want to answer in video form. Also, once again, be sure to check out my second channel, Board Game Basement, which is also linked down below. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you guys next time.